As motion designers, we know that there's always a look or an effect to debunk within After Effects. Today we're going to be designing this space poster using Illustrator, Photoshop, and After Effects. And then we'll be focusing on the typography treatment and animating it with an iridescent, holographic kind of look. So let's get into it. Hey guys, what's up? I'm Audrey Steeman and I'm a freelance designer, illustrator, and motion designer. And today I'm teaming up with School of Motion again to have some fun creating this motion poster with some animated iridescent typography. So today we're going to get into the sketch and design phase, mocking up the typography treatment, importing files into After Effects, and animating it all to look just like this. If you'd like to follow along and see how this project was made, feel free to download the free working files from the link in the description below. So with this poster, I'm kind of going with a more modular look. I want the typography to be the center of focus for this poster. And then I want to make sure I include all of the planets in the solar system and then just some supporting elements within outer space that'll kind of just fill the space up a little bit, no pun intended, and just kind of fill up the composition a little bit. So this is my super messy artboard here in Illustrator, and it kind of has a little bit of everything. We've got my sketch here, we've got the vectorized framework for the poster that we'll be importing into both Photoshop and After Effects for different reasons. We've got my selected color palette, we've got some typography specimens here of how I'd like to have that laid out here in the center. Have a little note to the side here of just things that I would like to incorporate in the poster. Some design examples. Definitely would love to use that texture element and kind of give it that 80s VHS vaporwave kind of look too. Also kind of combined with some Y2K elements like having some UI in there as if it was part of like the spaceship's control panel or something. And then we just have a reference of the solar system just so I don't mess up the order of planets. So this is kind of everything that I need right now, but something that I would highly recommend doing for any kind of motion project, especially when using vector stuff and a specific color palette, is going to your libraries and then making a library of those specific swatches so that when you go into After Effects, you already have this library and you can open that up, color pick from it, and it's super easy and you don't have to type in any hex codes or anything like that. So I would recommend making a library of your chosen colors before you really start. So something to kind of keep in mind as you're designing is kind of planning for if you want to design more heavy vector or raster. Nothing wrong with doing both. It's just more kind of planning ahead in your mind when you're in After Effects, what you plan on scaling more. Obviously, things are going to be kind of moved around. What stuff you can do within After Effects procedurally, aka nothing that's permanently changed to that asset. And anything that I'm exporting out of Photoshop is going to be at least double the size of the original artboard or composition size, just so that there's no question about its quality and that it's going to remain high res. Again, when you start stretching stuff and moving stuff around in After Effects, if it came from Photoshop or a raster image, things might get a little crunchy and might not look the best. So all that to say, just try to kind of plan out in your mind strategically how you plan on executing this animation and what assets you're going to need from where. You might kind of have to Frankenstein a couple programs together to get the look that you want. But it's better to kind of think ahead, plan ahead, rather than getting right into it and trying to animate your design when really there's more things you need than you thought. So now we're going to get into some of the fun parts where we're going to kind of render our sketch in the vector framework that we made in Illustrator and kind of make a style frame for ourselves. It's super important to have a style frame and kind of a North Star for reference of what you're going to be animating and especially with techniques within After Effects and how you can do things more smartly and how things should look at the end of it all. So here I'm in Photoshop and I kind of have everything here. I have the finished design as well, and I'll kind of walk through my file and how I did everything. So I have my sketch here that we know and love, and then we have the vector framework. And then I just took this vector framework and did a bunch of clipping masks, used some brushes for texture, filled in some color. So the file might be a little messy, but again, it's all more so for the style frame and knowing what other assets you might need later. So here's the final design, and I can kind of walk through the method to my madness here. One thing to note as well before I really get into this is when designing your style frames, especially if you're doing textured stuff like this and more illustrative kind of design, I made my canvas size Originally, it was 1080 by 1350, so it's kind of a poster size, but it works well for social media and stuff like that. But within Photoshop, I doubled that size so that if I needed to export anything directly from this design, it's going to be a little higher res than the original in case I need to stretch anything in After Effects. So just kind of keep in mind you want to work at a higher resolution, because it would suck to design everything and make everything look super nice, and then you go to try and animate it, and then it looks super crunchy and gross, and you don't want that. So yeah, kind of going layer by layer here. I've got a simple black background. I think this is the fill color from the color palette. Then I did a super simple grainy kind of bottom gradient here. And the way that I did that, I actually used the ellipse tool for the marquee tool, and then I think I did the feathering around 100. And then I just did a simple little ellipse like this, selected my purple here, filled it in so that it automatically kind of fades everything out. It feathers the outside there. And then I changed it to dissolve under the blending modes here. So it already kind of makes it grainy for you automatically. You don't have to really do anything special. And then this might sound super scrappy and not the most optimal way to do things, but again, for the sake of the style frame, I just kind of copied and pasted stuff from Illustrator and pulled them in as smart objects. So I kind of did that individually for some of these elements down here. The black and white rings that I had, simply just used the wand tool and kind of select every other ring, and then pretty much just filled in with the grainy brush that I was using. So it kind of gets that textured effect. And again, this is for the style frame. I'm keeping all of these individual assets from Illustrator to use in After Effects, so I can apply all of these textures and the look and everything in After Effects. So this is the vector sketch from Illustrator. I literally just copied it from Illustrator, and the proportion of the artboard is the same as this. So when I pasted it in, I just kind of had to scale it up, but it fit exactly to the original design. And then again, like I mentioned, I just used some clipping masks for some color. With the comet, I just selected shapes using the wand tool and then using a brush to kind of fill in that area, separated anything out in case I needed to edit that. And again, this is where you're kind of planning out and strategizing of what is going to be animated here. I think a big element in this for sure is going to be animating texture and the color and just shifting things around, making it feel very Space Odyssey, very magical and very mysterious. Then something I like to do with almost all of my designs or illustrations is add at least one layer of texture. And luckily, the ones that I picked here already kind of look like galaxy stars, which is fun. But you can find so many free textures online for your work. Just make sure you're allowed to use them, especially if it's for commercial work. And then I just set these textures to lighter color and then just kind of adjusted the fill for one of them just to lower it a bit. And then I have my typography. I have certain layer styles for these that luckily you can recreate within After Effects. So I'm not too worried about how it looks here and having to do anything special. But that's pretty much the gist. And so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of making this iridescent type effect. So getting into the really fun stuff with this iridescent type effect, I'll just kind of walk through each layer needed to get this desired effect. And something to keep in mind too, the layers within Photoshop will not be one-to-one within After Effects. Unfortunately, clipping masks aren't really much of a thing in After Effects, as well as gradient maps. It's all kind of treated a little differently in After Effects, so just keep in mind that even though this is going to be for the look, After Effects will kind of have a different treatment in terms of adjustments and whatnot to get this effect. So I'm going to hide everything for now and kind of go step by step into each component here. So with the type, you can kind of typeset whatever font or typeface that you'd like, and then we're going to apply a bunch of layer styles to this. So the first one that I did was just apply a light gray color overlay, and then we're going to do a slight inner shadow. So I think I have this set to pure black, multiply, 45% opacity, about half, a 90-degree angle, about 4 pixels of distance, 0% choke, and about 114 pixels for size. And then the last effect that we'll apply that kind of gives it the real foundation for the look is bevel and emboss. So for the settings here, I have inner bevel for style, smooth for technique, about 677 for depth, direction is up, Size is about 36 pixels, 0 for soften, 90-degree angle using global light, altitude 30 degrees, and then highlight mode is screen, opacity 50%, used a white color here, and then shadow mode multiply, used black, also at 50%. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to kind of skip these couple layers and go straight to gradient map, where that can kind of give us the basis of the look that we're going for, but still I'm not liking where it's at right now. I think there's too much color. It's a little harder to read. I would like to kind of adjust that a little bit. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to add this layer here that is purely just black and white. It's kind of grayscaled, and it's got like little spots of blacks, some of white, and then there's some gray here randomly. And you can kind of mess with this however you'd like. If you make sure it's set to overlay, this kind of gives a little more variation in the color and just the effect itself. But this is where you can kind of mess with having a black or white brush or like a gray and kind of just editing essentially how the color is forming here on the letters. So I found that you kind of want to stay within the different ranges of gray here just to not make it such a drastic change. And so yeah, you can kind of edit this however you want to get the effect that you want here. So I'm going to set this back to normal. And then these other two layers here are just texture. This is completely optional, but I think it kind of adds a little more to the physicality of it. So this one's set to overlay at 100%. And then this one on top of that is at hard light at 34%. So yeah, you can kind of just see some of that film grain and dust texture. I think just adds kind of another layer to it. And then another super important layer that you need to have is the gradient map. So if you go to adjustments, the second one from the bottom is gradient map, and then you can literally add whatever gradient map you would like. And then again, you want to make sure that this is a clipping mask, so it's just affecting the type here. And then for this gradient map that I made, I literally just copied right from the libraries and the swatches here and just added a bunch of points, moved them around. There's endless possibilities of what you can kind of make with your gradient map. But this is ultimately the super important layer that you want to have in order to get the look that you want. And then the last thing that I did, which is more of a stylistic choice, more so because of the typeface that I chose, I just copied this type layer for space and pasted it up above it, removed the fill, and gave it a stroke that's the same color as the background, just so it kind of cuts out some of the negative space within the letters so it's a little easier to read. But yeah, that's the gist of this type effect. It's super simple and super fun to mess around with. There's endless possibilities. So I hope this video serves as some inspiration to how you can animate even your most graphically designed ideas. Luckily, School of Motion has some great courses to get you on the right path to animating your designs, like After Effects Kickstart to jump into the world of motion design even for beginners. Also, the Design Kickstart course where you'll cover design fundamentals that you can bring into any project. So be sure to register and get on board. Links for those courses are in the description. So we've got our vectorized framework here, and some of the elements might look a little wonky and not true to the design, like these rings, for example, and the Saturn ring sticking out of the box. But that's so that when we're in After Effects, we can properly mask everything right and not have elements that are cut off, and we can't recreate that. And more importantly, you'll notice here on the right that all of the layers are grouped together properly and named, all ready to go. So there's two different ways I typically go about importing Illustrator files into After Effects. The first one anyone can do, which is going to After Effects. You can double click in this project menu here, finding your proper file and making sure you're importing as composition retain layer sizes. And you can have it create a composition too, and then we'll click import. So if we click on our composition here, which in Illustrator we have it the same size as our After Effects one, which is 1080 by 1350. And then we can take a look at the layers here and everything is named in an order like we had it in Illustrator. The only thing that really sucks about importing Illustrator files into After Effects like this is that any typography that you have won't convert it into a live type layer. And so you'll have to probably end up going to Layer, New, and Text Layer and recreating that yourself within After Effects. But the other way that I prefer to do, and it requires a plugin or an extension called Overlord by Battle Axe. I highly recommend it for anyone, especially to be able to skip that that importing step within After Effects, where if I drag this menu out here and have split shapes to layers selected here, then I can select all of these layers just by clicking and dragging and have everything selected here minus the color palette. And then I can just push the selection to After Effects, and it literally imports all of the layers that I had in Illustrator, all named and everything, and it even puts it in the right place. And the best part about it too is that all of the text layers are editable. So if I wanted to change the font, I could change it, and I can edit the size of it and whatever, but everything's there. And so I can quickly start applying all the settings and everything that I need to get going. And something else that's super important that I want to revisit Photoshop for is exporting any other assets that we might kind of need just for, gradient map stuff, texture stuff, to be able to use in our final motion poster. It's always great to use your own assets in your own motion designs, and they're always super easy to make. So for this, I just made a new file and made it similar to the double artboard size than we were typically using, just to have higher res. And then I did a fill layer and masked out the borders just to kind of have this as an asset. And then I did a couple gradient map stuff along with a black and white gradient map over that as well, because we'll need to use this later. But as you get through your motion design and After Effects, you'll kind of start to realize what other assets you might need, and you can easily go into Photoshop and make some quick textures and then just import those into After Effects. So here in After Effects, I imported those textures and everything, along with the texture elements I used in the final poster as well, and imported them all into their proper folders that they need to be in. And now we can get started. Okay, so now we're gonna get into the meat and potatoes of finally getting to animate our motion poster. So now we're gonna get into making this iridescent effect here in After Effects. So the first thing, you wanna make sure that you have your editable type, just in case you want that flexibility. If you wanna divide each letter into their own shape so you can animate the individual letters themselves, you can do that. But for this example, I'm just gonna keep it as is, but I just literally copied and pasted the space layer, the type layer from our main comp here, pasted it over here. And then similar to our Photoshop file, we're going to want to kind of replicate the effects that were used on that layer. So first things first, I'm going to do the color overlay, just a light gray. Then bevel and emboss. It should be similar settings to what you had in Photoshop, but you can obviously edit that here in After Effects too. And then an inner shadow. And again, it should be pretty similar to what you had in Photoshop. Next, we're going to add this grayscale layer that we made in Photoshop earlier. I'll just reapply that here just to show. So this is what we made in Photoshop, and it's pretty large, which is what we want. We want that versatility. And I also have an image of our final type specimen from Photoshop up here too, just as a reference, just so we can kind of match it. So I have the grayscale layer in here, and this is going to be super important here in a little bit. I want to set that to overlay. And then you want to set the track matte for this to that type layer, so it's just on the type layer. We'll come back to that here in a second. Next, I added just the couple of textures that we saw in Photoshop. Also going to make both of these track matted to the type layer, so it's only affecting the type. And then the most important layer that you want to have, which in Photoshop is considered the gradient map, but in After Effects, you're going to want to use an adjustment layer and apply Colorama. So you can go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, in your effects and presets, type in Colorama and double click on that. And then from here, you can adjust in the output cycle whatever colors you want and as many as you want. So I can edit each of these colors here to match with my color library that I made much earlier. And if you click in this immediate outer radius here from the color circle, you can keep adding more points. And then from here, you just want to edit these points to kind of align wherever you see fit. And this is where that grayscale gradient can come in handy. If you hit W to rotate a little bit, you can see that this gradient map affects kind of the direction of that colorama effect. So you can use that to your advantage too. So yeah, you get the gist there, but this is the final kind of outcome that I had. Something else to note that I forgot to mention is that for the texture layers here, which again are optional, I made the transparency about 9%. Obviously, you can crank it up however you'd like to get more of the look that you're going for. And then there's a couple ways you can animate the iridescent effect. Really what it comes down to is either animating the grayscale gradient here, or you can animate the colorama effect and using keyframes for that. The way I have it here in my example, I just rotated the grayscale gradient just a bit and then adjusted the position and rotation keyframes. I added an ease keyframe in the middle just so that it could loop easier. But this is a simplified way of being able to quickly animate this. You can obviously do as many keyframes as you want, different ways of adjusting your gradient map set to grayscale that can help that as well. But if we don't want to use the grayscale gradient layer for our animation, we can just take out all of these keyframes here and just edit the colorama effect. So I can set this gradient layer here wherever I want. And then if I go to the colorama layer and focus on output cycle here with this keyframe, I can add a keyframe there, and then I can add a keyframe at the very end, and then just alter a bunch of these color points here and changing it enough so that there's an obvious difference when the loop is over. Or you can edit these cycle repetitions. If you wanted to start out with 0.5 and you kind of have less variation in your colors, it's a little wider. And then if you end with a keyframe on 1, it'll kind of go right back to where the original design had it. So it's pretty cool. It looks like it's being lit up by a different kind of light source. Looks very metallic and like very physical. So this is another way that you can animate that effect. And now I'm going to add that final type treatment into my composition here. Make sure to get rid of the example here. So I want to make sure that the type is in the right spot. And then we can hide or remove that original flat type layer. So it's pretty cool. We kind of have like the main element already animated and it's there. Now we're going to start animating all of the other pieces to kind of fit that style frame that we originally made. So I think a cool effect actually for this could be using the texture layer that I had made in Photoshop and editing the rotation keyframes. So if I add a keyframe at the beginning of where it is now, and then I can just add a 1 to the cycles here, so it just does a full 360. Almost looks like it's going through phases like the moon or something, or like day to night. So I might tweak this a little bit, but it's kind of an idea for the motion that I'm thinking. And then we'll move on to the other elements. The shooting star took a bit to get looking right, but essentially it's composed of a shape layer for each the star and the tail, and also a shape layer with a path that I oriented the star and texture mask along, so I didn't have to keyframe all of that manually. The star has some rotation and scale keyframes, and applied to the path I made with the pen tool on a shape layer. The tail has a white fill on a shape layer, and my texture from Photoshop that is revealing the tail along the same path, with a few keyframe adjustments for proper timing. Like I mentioned earlier, it's always best to make your own assets for your animations. While I was working through this entire animation, I felt I needed to make an animated texture rather than continuing to use the same static one. I went into Photoshop and using the same file size as my original style frame, I made 3 separate layers using my texture brush, simply recreating a rectangle. By doing that, I know that each time I do this, it'll be slightly different, but not too jumpy when I put it into a timeline. And then I exported each layer as a transparent PNG. After making those additional assets, I double-clicked in my project panel and selected those 3 new textures and made a composition retaining layer sizes. I made the new comp 1 second and cut each texture's time to be 3 frames. I aligned them along the timeline, duplicated them, rotated them, flipped them, so that each frame was different. Now backing out to the larger comp, I right-clicked on my new moving texture pre-comp and went to Time, Enable Time Remapping. Moving my playhead a frame before the last keyframe that was generated, made a new keyframe, and deleted the last one. It sounds really odd, but it helps keep the animation continuous. Once you have that, you'll want to Alt or Option click on the Time Remap property, making an expression, and click on the circle arrow button on the right, and select Property, Loop Out, essentially making the texture loop. Then I'll extend the composition to the full timeline length, and now the texture loops. By the way, these are just a few expressions I use a lot in my own animations, but if you want a deeper look into expressions, I would recommend looking at School of Motion's Expression Session course. You can find the link for that in the description too. Now, we did a lot for this animation, but I want to add a few last effects to really send it home. All of these effects are applied to one adjustment layer on top within the master composition. First, a glow effect to bring out the vaporwave look in the bright areas. Second, we're going to make the whole composition jitter just a little bit using the transform effect, adding a wiggle expression to the position property. And lastly, a classic grain effect, because what's a design from the 80s without a little grain? And here is the end result. A little bit of a challenge for you. Try challenging yourself with designing a poster and then giving it some thoughtful motion. It's great for motion practice, but also makes for really good portfolio specimens, especially if you make it a series. So drop a comment below of what kind of poster you would design. I hope this video has been helpful, and remember to check out schoolofmotion.com for courses and resources that will prepare you for industry standard practices within the motion design world. And last but not least, remember to subscribe to both School of Motion and my own personal channel for more tutorials and tips like this. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!